When dignity met power. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Heritage Trust Bank as Margaret Williams stepped through the brass-trimmed doors. At 62, she carried herself with the quiet grace of someone who had earned every gray hair on her head. Her navy blue suit was impeccably tailored, and her leather briefcase bore the gentle scars of 3 decades in business. Margaret had built her company from nothing. Back in the 70s, when nobody wanted to give a young black woman a chance, she had started with a small corner store. Through years of sacrifice, wisdom, and unwavering determination, she had grown that single store into Williams Community Markets, a chain of 37 grocery stores that employed over 2,000 people and served neighborhoods that bigger chains had long forgotten. Today should have been simple. She needed to withdraw $50,000 in cash to pay the construction crew working on her newest store. The contractors were old school, preferring cash for their work, and Margaret respected that. She had called ahead yesterday to make sure the bank would have the funds ready. The young teller, who couldn't have been more than 25, looked up as Margaret approached. His name tag read, Brandon. He had that fresh-faced eagerness of someone new to the working world, his tie perhaps a bit too tight, his smile a bit too practiced. "Good morning," Margaret said warmly, sliding her withdrawal slip across the counter. "I called yesterday about a cash withdrawal. $50,000. Brandon's smile flickered. He glanced at the slip, then at Margaret, then back at the slip. "That's quite a large amount," he said slowly. "Yes, it is," Margaret replied patiently. "That's why I called ahead." The young man picked up the slip, studying it as if it were written in a foreign language. "I'll need to see some identification." Margaret had been through this before. Too many times, in too many places. But she had learned long ago that anger only made things worse. She reached into her purse and produced her driver's license, her credit cards, and her business identification. Brandon studied them for what felt like an eternity. Other customers were beginning to queue behind Margaret. She could feel their impatience, their eyes on her back. "Ma'am," Brandon said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt even more insulting than if he had shouted, "I'm going to need to verify this with my supervisor." Margaret took a slow breath. "I've been banking here for 20 years, she said quietly. "My account information should show that clearly." "It's just procedure," Brandon said, but his eyes told a different story. They held that particular kind of doubt that Margaret knew all too well. The doubt that came not from her credentials, but from her skin. The minutes ticked by. Margaret watched as Brandon served 3 other customers, white customers, each conducting their transactions smoothly and quickly. One man withdrew $20,000 with nothing more than a signature and a smile. Finally, a woman in her mid-50s approached the counter. Patricia Henderson, according to her brass nameplate. Assistant branch manager. She had carefully styled blonde hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Is there a problem?" Patricia asked, directing her question to Brandon rather than Margaret. "This woman wants to withdraw $50,000, Brandon said, as if Margaret weren't standing right there. Patricia picked up Margaret's identification, examining it with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for counterfeit bills. "Mrs. Williams," she said slowly, "this is a very substantial withdrawal." "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "Which is why I called ahead yesterday to arrange it." "We have no record of that call," Patricia said crisply. Margaret felt something shift inside her. She had spent her whole life being patient, being understanding, making it easier for other people to accept her presence. But there were moments when patience became complicity in your own diminishment. "Then perhaps you should check again," Margaret said, her voice still gentle but carrying a new weight. "I spoke with someone named Jennifer. She assured me everything would be ready." Patricia's lips thinned. "Jennifer isn't here today. And regardless, I'm going to need additional verification before I can release this amount of cash to you." "What kind of verification?" Margaret asked. "We need to confirm that this money isn't for illegal purposes," Patricia said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Behind Margaret, the line had grown longer. She could feel the discomfort of the other customers, could practically hear their silent judgments forming. "Illegal purposes," Margaret repeated slowly. "I'm withdrawing money from my own account to pay my construction contractors." "So you say," Patricia replied. "But we have protocols to prevent money laundering and fraud." Margaret had reached a point in her life where she understood that some battles couldn't be won with patience alone. She had earned her dignity through hard work and integrity. She would not let it be stripped away in this marble-floored temple of money and prejudice. "Let me speak to the branch manager," Margaret said. "I am the assistant manager," Patricia replied. "And I'm telling you that without proper verification, I cannot release these funds." "Then get me someone who can," Margaret said, and now there was steel beneath the velvet of her voice. Patricia's face flushed. "Ma'am, if you're going to be difficult about this, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I'm not leaving without my money," Margaret said quietly. The bank had grown silent. Everyone was watching now. Margaret could see the security guard shifting his weight near the door, his hand moving closer to his radio. Patricia leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be. These are standard procedures. Standard procedures that you didn't apply to the gentleman who just withdrew $20,000, Margaret observed. "That was a different situation," Patricia said quickly. "Different how?" Margaret asked. "Because I'm quite certain the amount I'm withdrawing is larger, which should require less scrutiny, not more." Patricia's mouth opened and closed. Behind her, Brandon had gone very still, perhaps beginning to realize that he had set something in motion that he couldn't control. "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave," Patricia said, her voice rising slightly. Margaret reached into her briefcase. Patricia actually took a step back, and Margaret felt a wave of profound sadness. That this woman, in this place, could look at a 62-year-old grandmother in a business suit and see a threat. Margaret pulled out a folder. From it, she extracted a single sheet of paper. She placed it gently on the counter between them. "Before you make that call," Margaret said softly, "you might want to look at this." Patricia picked up the paper. Margaret watched as the woman's face went through a remarkable transformation. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that might have been fear. The paper was a stock certificate. It showed that Margaret Williams held controlling interest in Heritage Trust Bank. 51% of the shares, to be exact. "I don't understand," Patricia whispered. 20 years ago, Margaret said, her voice carrying now, clear enough for everyone in the bank to hear, "when I brought my business to this bank, it was struggling. The previous owners had made poor investments and were on the verge of bankruptcy. I made them an offer. I would invest heavily in the bank, turn it around, but I wanted controlling interest. They agreed." Margaret paused, letting this sink in. "I could have made my ownership public," she continued. "I could have put my name on the building, installed myself as president, made everyone know exactly who I was. But I believed that the bank would serve the community better if people saw it as a neighborhood institution, not a business empire. So I stayed silent. I let the board run the daily operations. I only asked for one thing, that this bank serve everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from." Patricia's hands were shaking. The paper fluttered slightly. "Now," Margaret said, and her voice was gentle again, "I'm going to ask one more time. May I please have my $50,000? From my own bank." The silence in the building was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. Patricia turned and walked quickly toward the back. Margaret could see her picking up a phone, speaking urgently. Within 2 minutes, a man in his late 60s emerged. Richard Chen, the bank president. Margaret had appointed him 5 years ago, impressed by his integrity and his vision for community banking. "Mrs. Williams," Richard said, his face grave as he approached. "I'm deeply sorry. If I had known you were here, having difficulties." "You weren't meant to know," Margaret said. "That was rather the point. I wanted to see how an ordinary customer would be treated." Richard looked at Patricia, at Brandon, and his expression hardened. "We will address this," he said quietly. "Immediately." "See that you do," Margaret replied. "Because if this is how your staff treats someone like me, I can only imagine how they treat people with less means and less recourse." Richard personally handled Margaret's withdrawal, apologizing 3 more times as he counted out the bills. Margaret accepted the apologies with grace, but she could see in his eyes that he understood. This wasn't just about one transaction. It was about every transaction, every customer, every moment of dignity given or denied. As Margaret prepared to leave, Patricia approached her, tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Williams," she said, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I just thought." "You thought what?" Margaret asked gently. "That I didn't belong here. That I couldn't possibly have earned enough money to make a large withdrawal." That I must be up to something criminal. Patricia couldn't meet her eyes. The problem, Patricia, Margaret said softly, isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you saw a black woman and you made assumptions. You applied rules inconsistently. You denied me the basic courtesy that you extended to others without a second thought. I'm so sorry, Patricia whispered again. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. She saw a woman who was probably not malicious, just thoughtless. Someone who had absorbed the prejudices of the world around her without ever examining them. I hope you'll learn from this, Margaret said finally. I hope you'll remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone by what they look like rather than who they are. Margaret walked out of Heritage Trust Bank with her head high and her money in her briefcase. But she felt no triumph, only a deep weariness. How many times had she proven herself? How many more times would she need to? That evening, Margaret sat on her back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her daughter Angela, 40 years old and a civil rights attorney, sat beside her. You should fire them, Mom, Angela said after Margaret had told her the story. Perhaps, Margaret said. Or perhaps they'll learn more by staying. Richard is a good man. He'll make sure this doesn't happen again. You're too forgiving, Angela said. Margaret smiled. I'm not forgiving anything. I'm choosing how to fight my battles. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show people who you are and let them sit with their own shame. You could have told me you owned the bank, Angela said. All these years. You never needed to know, Margaret replied. You've built your own path, your own success. That's what matters. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. Margaret thought about all the years of struggle, all the times she had been underestimated, dismissed, denied. But she had persisted. She had built something real and lasting. Not just for herself, but for her community. Mom, Angela said softly, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of us, Margaret replied. Of everyone who came before us and everyone who'll come after. We keep showing up. We keep proving ourselves. And slowly, maybe too slowly, the world changes. The next week, Heritage Trust Bank announced a new comprehensive staff training program on bias and customer service. Richard Chin personally oversaw every session. Patricia Henderson requested a transfer to a smaller branch where she could start over, hopefully wiser than before. And Margaret Williams continued to show up every few weeks to conduct her business, always treated now with impeccable courtesy. But she knew that courtesy shouldn't depend on who you are. It should be freely given to everyone. That, she thought, was worth fighting for. Thank you for listening to this story from the Black Voices. If this story touched your heart or made you think, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories, and leave a comment telling us what this story meant to you. Your support helps us continue sharing these important voices and experiences. Until next time, remember that dignity and respect should never have to be earned, they should be freely given.